we're about to have an interesting discussion on the nature of duality and how that duality is related to the entire rayed system, but especially the iris of the eye. Now we have some really beautiful, fun friends in the audience who are going to chime in with their experiences and their own knowledge. One of them is my dear friend John Miles, who's the foremost designer of cameras and taker of very precise iris photography. His system, he takes these, and we have really many opportunities to take these photographs. That's John Miles. Jennifer Levine, who's been basically also in the work for 25 years or thereabouts. Caroline Brock, who is primarily very new to the system, so we have different levels of experiences about the life experiences, and so we're going to talk about duality, polarity, union, man, woman, electromagnetic, a whole bunch of things about how it's all related. So, here we go. So the topic is the duality as it is reflected in the structure of the iris of the eye. So the two forms of extremes about the iris constitution is going to be this dynamic flow of, sometimes we would call this the flower, but it's the space-like openings, and we would call this an expansive type, or in the world of duality in physics, it would be the magnetic or emanating type. Opposite this are the dot-like configurations on the opposite side, and these brown points are what we call the constrictive points, or the jewel. So this is the electromagnetic duality, and it's the circulation of these two polarized opposites that make up all of the other duality substructures, because there's going to be an infinite number of duality substructures. These dualities, they go into mother and father and left brain and right brain. They go into all of the systems of the grandparents and all of the sequences of the birth order and so on and so on, and each one of them has a typical body type and everything about that. So this is the beginning of the understanding of the magnetic or expansive. This is the constrictive. All of these have ultimately personality attributes and all the things that we recognize. And then they'll have a whole characteristic qualities of symptoms and social attractions, relationship attractions. They'll have a way that they express and feel. So we want to be able to know these two opposites. Now, part of the reason that this is important is because these two, they have completely different ways of experiencing the reality of the world. For example, this one here experiences the world through somewhat of a emanating, soft, cat-like touching of things, which produces a feeling of reaction or a flow to. This is a dynamically flowing, and oftentimes they now dynamically flow toward others. So they are more involved in the experience of dynamically relating in some form to others. Whereas the more jewel type has a tendency to go more constrictive, and that constrictive process is more of an interior experience of relating to self through the process of also observing the reality around them, communicating in a different mannerism, have a different gestural, postural form, a different way of feeling other people. Both of these sides have feelings. They process the feelings in different ways. For example, the feeling type on this side is more spontaneous and emotive and has rolling, undulating waves, and it splashes. Whereas the feeling on this side has a tendency for more controlled experiences of feelings, but they last longer. If you look at it on a wave pattern, this one has more of a tendency to do wave flows. They can be bigger ones or higher ones. The opposite one has more of a tendency for the experience of, doing it in little small pointed things. So it's like, it's a whole different way. But over a time period, if you graft the amount of time that this one has an experience of feelings, it's in a feeling fast and it very quickly drops off. Whereas the more dual type pattern has a gradually increasing experience of feeling and the amount of time is longer. But at the end, the area under the curve, the amount of feeling is identical. It's just how they process the feelings. So this one processes the feelings through spontaneity, they process them through emotional reaction, they also have their own characteristic way of being dependent or needy in some way. They very much desire something to use their magnetic force to gather in and feel. The dual type one has a concentration within itself, and it looks to go out in some way to find some way to open it up. Now I call these two types distinctly different types. Now people at times have really asked me, how can you take a pattern that is anatomically called something else and call it a flower? How can you call it a jewel? I mean, isn't that rather strange to call something a jewel or a flower? I try to use symbols in nature, like a jewel, like an amethyst or a crystal or a diamond, because there's positive attributes to this characteristic of constriction, which is very different than the positive attributes of this flower-oriented, emanating, colorful, fragrant, calling, shouting thing. The way a field of flowers is very different from a field of diamonds. So these attributes are very beautiful. However, what I always like to remind people of is that this characteristic here is, if I might say that this is the flower and this is the jewel, this is not me. This is not me. These are characteristic filters about how myself is expressing its self. So really what I am is actually something in between this. I'm something like this that has, I'm just using another symbol. I'm using this, six-pointed star and a circle to show my constrictive six-pointed star, and my circle being that. My soul is composed of this one and this one. I have both. I may have a duality tendency to express myself more through this side or more through this side, but they're both equally important to the existence of my own soul. I can call this divine masculine because it is expansive and ever growing. I can call this the divine feminine because it's inwardly seeking and also infinitely growing inward. So this is the broad range of the duality of how my soul is experiencing the material world that becomes later how I'm experiencing the spiritual world and my own soul. So when I look at someone, I'm going, you're expressing yourself through this one. But somewhere else, you're likely to have a soulmate that's probably something like this. And then people will attract relationships based on the opposite, even though they bring one different one to the picture. So these extremes, if I'm this constitution, I may need to learn how to be this one. So there's a certain objectivity about looking at one's own iris to objectively say, this is my attribute or my condition. So if I'm a jewel, I'll have attributes of being the seeker, a constantly looking, seeking quality. But if I'm a constantly seeking jewel type, and I'm not integrating the emotional side of myself, my mind can become an intellectual monkey going from one branch to another, obsessively, critically analyzing and getting nowhere. But if I incorporate the experience of the expansive feeling, now I can do both sides of this, and my soul is actually growing by having a union of the duality opposites. That is as much of a simplified overview as I can give in the moment, because we could go on showing examples of this with irises and nature and hot and cold in the body, parasympathetic, sympathetic, sweet, sour, acid, alkaline, and all of the other variabilities of that. And there are subsets of the dualities and subsets of the subsets. Questions, my dear friends? Silence is a form of expansiveness, because it is a form of divine expansiveness. So, for me, this also is the mother's side of the family and the father's side of the family, and there's a self quality to the mother's side versus a social function to the father's side. So the left brain of the masculine yang has a lot to do with the experience of social involvement. The feminine or the yin qualities of this have a lot to do with the characteristics of the divine feminine of self. Now, what's going to be a little bit challenging for some people is that this pattern and this pattern, they'll be altered by the gender of the person who has this iris. For example, if I'm a man and I have this structural pattern, later I'll explain why, but I'm going to be experiencing what's called the ascending masculine quality of this, which I've oftentimes called 2, 4, and 6. The 2, 4, and 6 now helps me recognize if it's a man doing this, I'm going to have varying degrees of octaves of dualities, because there's a duality between 2 and 4 and 4 and 6. These are progressions of dualities that are, if you will, octaves of force. So this is a fire. Now, if this were a woman, I'd automatically change the interpretation to bring this into what I call a descending yin. And the descending yin has 6 and 4 and 2. The descending yin is the silence of soft and open and peace. So the descending yin and the ascending yang of the same structural kind of pattern. So you end up with a way of looking at dualities on top of dualities. So for me, there's just virtually no way to correctly interpret what an iris is doing without knowing the gender of that occupant of that pattern. Now, I know that's a lot to get first, but the same thing is true if I'm talking about the constrictive nature of this. If this is a woman, constrictive, then I know I'm going to end up with what's called 5, 3, 1. And this is a grounding constrictiveness using this. This is a yang form of gender-specific feminine constrictiveness. So is it possible to be a yang woman and a yin man with both of these opposite dualities? Yes, indeed. Now, on the opposite side, if I'm a dual-oriented constrictive and I'm gender-specific masculine, then it's going to be basically a ascending, which is going to be a different numerical sequence, triangles, because these represent masculine, 1, 3, and 5. Now I'm going to have an ascending constrictive, or a descending constrictive. Now these 12 different attributes are the extremes of these two forms of duality. If I want to be myself, then I want to be able to occupy, because I have the desire to do so, the full extent of my expansive and the full extent of my constrictive, both feminine and masculine on both sides, so I want to be able to choose to know myself more completely. Well, if we can call a nutshell, that's basically where we are for now. We're going to continue this discussion at another time, very soon, to be able to describe this much more thoroughly with some questions from the silent gallery. For now, thanks for stopping by. Talk to you soon.